Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk a bit about the staggering increase in numbers of in the mass migration. This is happening, all over the Western world, but it's a one-way traffic of people movement, illegals. It's not. There's nothing organic about it at all. Nothing organic. This is all orchestrated and stage managed by the globalists and the Western governments and the NGOs that they control and fund and reward. So, but I just want to give you some idea as to the numbers that are happening now. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, then that was sort of like a trumpet blast to the globalists. We now can control everything, and when communism as a state-sponsored system is now gone, China wants to become part of the system, so we can forgive their communism. So communism as a state-sponsored sort of process of government or ideology is gone, and so we can do what we want now. And boy, that's definitely what they did. And so that's when the mass migration kicked off at that time, and it began and it moved sort of fairly quickly to where we see it today. So just using Britain as an example, and I'm going to mention Australia. For example, last year, Australia brought, it's just immigrants, most of them from India, the Australian government, the left-leaning globalist Australian government, brought in 1.75% of the population. So just in 1 year, the amount of migrants being brought in equaled 1.75% of the total population of the country. Just in 1 year. That is mass migration. None of them are needed. None of them have skills at all. Maybe 10,000 of them perhaps have skills, but the other 400,000 have nothing. So just looking though at the numbers in Britain, now the average per year, so the average per year between 1988 and 1998 in Britain was 41,000 immigrants per year, and that's as I understand it, the total figure. There was, the amount of illegals were pretty much irrelevant at the time. So, at a population of circa 60 million, the British government was bringing in about 40,000 migrants a year. Now that's, if you're looking at skilled migrants, people that integrate, people that speak the language, or very, very genuine cases of asylum, that sort of thing, then that's about what you'd expect. Those are about though, if you were looking at what's an organic figure or close to organic figure, then that would be it, that sort of ratio. The amount of skilled people in the third world is very small. Just to give you an idea, there are entire countries in Africa that have fewer doctors in them than a regional town in Australia. So that'll just give you an idea as to the, how short they are on the skills. And the same is for places like Bangladesh and Pakistan. So they just don't, this idea that all the mass migrants are rocket scientists is, of course, absolute lunacy, an outrageous lie that the globalist script requires the puppet governments in the West to repeat. But so between 1988 and 1998, in that 10 years, 88 to 98, migration in Britain increased from 41,000 a year to 172,000 a year. This is an average over the time. So that's a 400+% increase just in one decade. Now that's since the like Tony Blair came in and the globalist government thing kicked off. That's when Tony Blair got into office as Prime Minister of Britain and the Labor Party, they were totally globalist owned. and delivered as required to the globalist ideology with the mass migration, which is a central plank of the globalization project. It not only supplies cheap labour and this sort of thing, or cheaper labour, depresses wages, but it also adds a layer or a level of severe dysfunction into the local society, which again is vital to the globalist project. So then it increased from 170,000 per year, and then the following 10 years it went to nearly 240,000 yearly average, up to where we see today 500 or 600,000 last year, but just under 500,000 type averages. So we're looking at 1,200 to 1,500% of the 1980s levels. And the same goes in Australia. And there was a report, a sort of, I don't know what you call it, secret necessarily, but it was one that was kept well buried. But I managed to have a look at it. It was a public service report in Australia that out of every 100,000 mass migrants that come to Australia, how many of them actually have desire, needed, usable skills that can speak English, and they can pretty much walk straight out the door and kind of get a job, and they can integrate well. They speak the language, that sort of thing. Their children have already been to English language schools, so their integration. How many out of every 100,000? And they're saying about 5%, and they're even suggesting that's generous. So the reality is probably closer to 3%, maybe 3.5%. So let's say out of every 100,000 mass migrants coming to Australia, and I think this would apply equally to the rest of the world. Again, that there aren't many rocket scientists around in the rest of the world. Once you go outside the advanced economies, you've got hardly any qualified people, or very, very small number, and they're desperately needed in their own countries anyway. But out of every 100,000 migrants, you're probably looking at 3,500 that have got any skills or anything that can be used to benefit the local economy and the local society. The rest are just a dead weight. Why are they even here, for goodness sakes? Now, there was a lot of talk when the mass migration kicked off that there would be that the people coming would be they'd all speak good English, they'd all have internationally recognised qualifications, and they'd all be a great benefit. And we were told, in Australia at least, and elsewhere around the world, that there was this very sudden and incredible skills shortage of skills. There was just a huge and massive shortage, just suddenly erupted. Out of nowhere it came, this sudden skill shortage. So the only solution to the skill shortage was to import masses of illiterate brown and black peasants from the third world, people who had no skills whatsoever and couldn't speak a lick of English. They were illiterate in their own language, and somehow that would correct the skills shortage in the advanced economies of the West. Now, those were the lies that were peddled, and they were sort of additional, lie upon lie. Well, our economy cannot grow unless we import these skills. Now, if the economy can't grow, that means Armageddon is going to be the end of the universe. Of course, which is again more lies upon more lies upon more lies. So now, if it was so necessary to import these skills, was such a good idea, you don't need to tell that many lies. You don't need to tell any lies. You can say, look, here's the real benefit. But the people, and I met a lot of these people that were coming from these third, rural Chinese peasants that couldn't speak a word of English, and again were illiterate in their own language. And I've done a lot of business traveling around the world, and I still do some. And I get to you see the behaviour and mannerisms of rural peasants. You understand them, and as soon as you see it, you can spot it. So I can spot it at 100 paces. Someone else couldn't, but because of my exposure to those cultures and those sort of people and that type of thing, I can see it straight away. So you can see these masses of people moving around, and they're all rural fucking peasants. Also, you can tell from the dialect. I mean, I speak Chinese, and so I can listen to that and say, hey, those aren't city people, not the way they're talking. So the reality was that we were importing illiterate peasants, nothing like the supposed, as it was being said, they're all engineers and rocket scientists and doctors. They're not. Even if they were, the standard of education in these third world countries that are very, very corrupt is that if you have enough money, you can pay the university to just give you an engineering degree. So you actually haven't got a degree. I noticed this with wealthy Indians, the Brahmins that were coming in, that they typically hadn't done the work, they hadn't done the study. They'd simply bribed the lecturer to give them a PhD in something, or bribe the university to give them a PhD in something, because that was befitting their social status in the society. So they would come to Australia assuming that, waving their PhD around and assuming that they'd be feted as being, great and knowledgeable people, but when you expect them to actually do some work, they thought work was beneath them. But I'm a Brahmin, work is beneath me. I can strut around with high social status and everybody bows down before me, but the idea of I have to work for a living, that's vulgar, it's uncouth. How dare you try and make me do work? And that attitude was something that I constantly came across with the first lot of Brahmins coming to Australia. Work was simply beneath them. And when it was told them, look, you actually have to work. You're being paid to do a job. You have to work. They just couldn't understand it. So, well, no, my social status means I don't have to do this. So you can get those sort of people at one end, and not very many. And then at the other end, you get, of course, the illiterate peasants. But the numbers are staggering in the increase. But I wanted to highlight, as I have before, that there is nothing organic about these sort of numbers. And the numbers of people that are needed in the economy in Australia would be somewhere between 15 and 20,000 per year. That's all that would genuinely be needed, and even that's probably generous. And that also encourages a lot of laziness in Australia, where we don't need to bother to train and produce our own experts or our own doctors or rocket scientists. But we can just import them, job done. So that creates a laziness that in itself breeds a form of moral hazard. That, well, why do we need to bother? We can just push a button and it'll all arrive. We can just lobby the government or bribe our local politicians. It creates a form of corruption of purpose, leading, of course, to other forms of corruption. Once it's a path you go down, it becomes a self-defeating path, like an odd sort of Ponzi scheme. But I just wanted to look at those numbers, because even when Australia was desperately trying to populate itself, in the 1950s and 1960s, and they were bringing out people from the refugee camps in Europe, Italians and Greeks during the communist insurgency and the Civil War and that sort of stuff, and they always preferred, if they could get them, they always preferred to get white English speaking people if they could possibly do that. But even then, the numbers at the time pale into insignificance compared to the numbers today. Migrants people were now. Then they needed, and the economy was growing rapidly. People could literally walk, and then they had also a high standard. If you look at the immigration to Australia, say, I don't know, in the 1960s as an example, and you look at the manifests of some of the the migrant ships and that sort of stuff coming in, and you go through it, you see that everyone's pretty much, you do get exceptions, everyone's pretty much got a skill of some sort. They're a carpenter, or they're a bricklayer, or they're a nurse, or they're something, an accountant or whatever. They've all got some sort of qualification or skill that's needed in the economy. So compared to today, the standards back then for accepting a migrant were quite rigorous. And the Australian government would even subsidise a migrant to come out, provided they had a skill, and if they were under a certain age, and they had young children, that type of thing. So they would help subsidise that, but you had to bring something to the table, and people that skills, spoke English, and so on, and they were assisted in coming out to Australia. Or indeed you'd see something not dissimilar, for example, in Canada or New Zealand and so on. So, but that's different today. Illiterate third world peasants have no intention of fitting in, couldn't fit in anyway. They're illiterate in their own language, can't speak a word of English, have no qualifications. They're being brought into the West now by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions. Multiple millions are being brought in, and how that can be, the only effect it can have, in my view at least, is an undesirable one, and I think that's being clearly demonstrated. I just want to look at some of the propaganda about, say, London today, where London's always been a city of migrants and London's always been diverse and yada yada yada, and there's an implication that something like, even in 1950, that 5% of the population of London, it's inferred, are black, or Indian for that matter. That's actually not quite right. If you look at the numbers there, when they say non-English born, they talk about black and brown, and then they go to non-English born, and it would be easy to assume, well, what they mean by that is, people from the Caribbean or in the Indian subcontinent who came to Britain, black and brown people, and but that's not what they meant. When you actually drill down to the numbers, there were a lot of refugees that were left over from World War II that had come to Britain. So we're talking about, Polish people, French people, Scandinavian people, people from Central Europe, and so on. And they'd come to Britain during World War II or shortly thereafter, but around that time, and also in the 1950s with the Hungarian uprising, Hungarians coming. So really, the people that were there weren't black or brown at all. There were some, but not very many. And at around that time, the ones that weren't native born were primarily those, Polish and so on. But they were still white, they were still Christian, and they were very determined to integrate. I remember at school here in Australia, there was a kid with a Polish name, and his folks still had an accent, an obvious East European Slavic type accent, but he had an English accent, and it was the same. His father, as I understand it, had been an aircraft, like a pilot, a fighter pilot or something during World War II. So they stayed in England, then decided to emigrate to Australia. So, but coming back to this idea of the mass migration, we've got to really remember and always come back, it's a globalist scam. None of it is even remotely or a tiny bit organic, nor are these people deciding to up stakes from the likes of fucking Bangladesh or something like that, or India, and come to the West. Just oh yeah, I know what I'll do. I'm an illiterate peasant living in a village in the middle of nowhere, but I know what I'll do. I'll take the journey to the West to improve my life. That's not happening. The idea that some illiterate peasant in the middle of nowhere, whether it be in Africa or Pakistan or Bangladesh, would do that is absurd. It's even beyond their realms of contemplation. They're being, there are UN, NGO, globalist activists fanning out across all of these third world countries, and activists and agitators, paid activists and agitators that are also taking secret commissions and so on for anyone they dupe or sucker in. And they're going to these people, guess what? You go to here and they'll give you a free house, and they'll free this and free that and free so-and-so, lots of hot white blonde chicks, and that's where you need to go. And so they're being ginned up. And again, professional agitators are running around doing this stuff, and also promising them, look, the logistics of you getting from, the middle of Africa or the middle of Pakistan or something, or Bangladesh, the logistics from getting you from there into the Western Europe, we'll take care of all that for you. Well, what am I going to do for clothes? We'll supply the clothes. What am I going to do about food and drink? We'll supply the food and drink. What am I going to do about having a shelter and a place? We'll supply the shelter. Well, how am I going to travel that distance? We'll supply the transport. We'll supply everything for you. We'll get you there. And so this is how it's happening. without that professional agitators running around stirring them up, without the massive logistical machine helping them, that they wouldn't even dream of attempting to make the journey. And I just want to add that the immigration into Europe, for example, at the moment is the number one arrivals are from Bangladesh. Number two are from Pakistan. And number three was another country. None of these countries are at war. None of them are in civil war or any sort of civil strife. And these people that are doing the journey, these illiterate peasants that are doing the journey, and it's the illiterate peasants that are the most susceptible to this agitation. Someone who's got a decent middle class job in I don't know, Pakistan or somewhere, India. They're going to be much less susceptible. They're going to be literate. They're not really going to be interested in this sort of thing, or certainly not to anywhere near the same extent. Then, when you look at this level of agitation or the scale of it, we have to understand there are tens of thousands of agitators and stirrers all around these third world countries, and wherever there's a refugee camp. Say there is a civil war somewhere, or has been, or maybe a drought or something like that. Again, agitators everywhere stirring these people up, encouraging them, exhorting them. Well, you go and break the law. You go to Western Europe, just break the immigration laws. No one's going to care. Don't worry about it. We've got all these human rights lawyers that we pay for that'll look out for you and make sure you don't get deported and so on. Services that aren't available to illegal migrants. You have to be illegal to be able to access all this freebie stuff. So we really need to understand that, understand the extent of the scam here. How many of these people would still make these journeys if they weren't getting stirred up and recipients of all this agitation by the globalist cabal. The reality is they wouldn't. There are genuine cases of civil war and things like that, but then you should move to the nearest safe country where there may be refugee camps and the like there. Excuse me, where you can stay and be fed and housed and so on, and then go back to your country. But remember, we're talking about illiterate peasants that live in small villages who've never known anything other than the village that they live in, and the people, their family and wider family, and the vast network of cousins and second cousins and the like. That's the only life they know, and suddenly they decide, I know what to do. I think I'll go to England. Yeah, that's what. No, they don't. They have to be assured and stirred up and constantly, reminded that you should go. And the stories around some of them being paid cash bonuses to go, or their families are paid cash bonuses. So will you let little Abdul, or whatever, go to the West, and we'll give you, what would seem like a lot of money to them, $100 US or something, and then they'll put pressure on Abdul to go. So all these things are happening. So again, there's nothing organic about it, nothing at all, and we have to accept that and understand it. You've been with Tacitus today in your Pushback Challenge. Thank you for listening.